Today's lesson takes us to Exodus chapter 3. If you'd like to join along in the reading, we'd be glad to have you do so. We didn't want to leave the idea of the big picture of the Bible without dealing with the story of the burning bush, one of the strangest and most magnificent stories that we have in this part of the Bible. The story of Moses is at a crossroads here. If you know the story, you know what I'm talking about. Moses has spent the first 40 years of his life in Egypt as, mostly at least, as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, in the house of Pharaoh, living as an Egyptian, knowing all the while, it seems, that he is in fact a Hebrew, that he does in fact belong to this traveling band of nomads that has been living in Egypt ever since Joseph's day and now is not welcome anymore, and in fact is being kept down and enslaved and threatened at its very core of existence. And there is this God that the people have worshipped for hundreds of years now. Most people who read the Bible are estimating about 400 years or so that they've been in bondage at this point. Some say it's a little bit less, but I lean toward the 400-year number. And for 400 years, God has been silent, as far as we can tell. He has not communicated with his people. And it seems that with many of the Hebrews, many of the Israelites, the image of the God of heaven, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has faded into the background and almost disappeared. There are clearly some faithful ones. Moses' family seems to be one of those. But after 40 years, he attempts to lead the people in rebellion and is rebuffed by the people themselves. And so he leaves for the desert and lives in, depending on which story you want to believe, either Arabia or Sinai. There are different theories as to where the actual Mount Sinai was. At any rate, he is in the middle of nowhere, from his perspective at least. And he meets up with a family of Midianites. He marries one of their daughters, and for 40 more years, he lives in seclusion as a shepherd. And here at the end of this, as he is beginning his third part of his life, he is called by God to go and deliver the people as he had planned to do 40 years earlier and was not accepted by the people. But now it's God's mission. Now we're not doing Moses' plan, now we're doing God's plan. And it's going to look very different. And it begins with an understanding of who this God is, a God that Moses may not have properly appreciated, but hopefully at least at the end of this story is going to appreciate somewhat more. And the big picture emphasis that we're going to be stressing here in this lesson is the nature of God and his relationship with his people, and how this story, I believe, is not really supposed to make sense. It's not supposed to define God. It's rather supposed to tell us that God is undefinable, that God does not fit into a box, that he does not look like these Egyptian gods or any other god that you might have heard of. And I believe this is the only time that God is depicted as something other than a human being, when he takes on some kind of form. The text is going to talk about the angel of the Lord, and then afterward it's going to be talking about the Lord or God there in the bush. Clearly, this is not God himself. It's not even the angel. It's a representation of what is going on. And occasionally you'll get God walking around among human beings in human form, and that also, I believe, is a manifestation of angels. But here, it's very different. Here it is an image that defies description and defies explanation entirely. And again, I believe that's going to be the entire point. I want you to read with me, if you will, in Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw the bush was on fire, but was not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, he answered. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their sufferings, and I have come to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them from that land to a good, spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, Hethites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So because the Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way of the Egyptians are oppressing them, therefore go, I am sending you to Pharaoh, so that you might lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses asked God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He answered, I will certainly be with you, and will be the sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. Then Moses said to God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you will say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. This notion of the God who is, the God who exists, it's a fascinating description here. And I don't believe that I am is supposed to be understood to be the actual name of God rather than Yahweh or Jehovah or however it might be pronounced. Rather, it is a definition of who he is. Some say that it would be equally well translated, I am the one who was, or I am what I am. I am that which has always been, or words to that effect. He is the God who exists, the God who has always existed. And that may not be something that the people of God have understood for the last 400 years or so, but they are going to understand it much better with the help of Moses. And that's going to be the story of the book of Exodus, essentially. We're not going to get into all of that, of course, but what we are going to talk about a little bit is what this particular story has for us. Some big picture lessons from the burning bush. One, God is undeniable and yet inexplicable. That is an amazing concept to me. I found myself thinking about this a lot in preparation for this lesson. God is that which is absolutely unbelievable, and yet he is that thing that is absolutely undeniable. This is the great frustration that we get with those who want to deny the existence of God, because how could he possibly exist? You're talking about something that you can't see, you can't know. He's invisible. You brag about him being invisible, of course. The idea that he's not present, it's silly. You have absolutely no evidence. And what we say is, but we have all the evidence in the world. We have the world itself as evidence. The existence of God cannot possibly be denied. It just depends on the way you look at it. Are you a person of faith, or are you not a person of faith? That's what the burning bush is, essentially. The burning bush is not a depiction of God. It is that thing that could not possibly exist and yet exists. I don't believe that this is some kind of a red bush that Moses had never seen before, and that it looked like it was on fire, but it wasn't really. I believe that the Texas Best understood exactly the way that it appears in the reading here, that it is a bush. In fact, it's relatively well established what kind of bush it probably was, and it appears to be on fire, and it burns, and it burns, and it burns. We've all seen things burning before. We've all seen them burn themselves out at some point. Some fuel lasts longer than others, but eventually all fuel is consumed. That's what fire does. But not this fire, not this bush. This is something that is beyond our understanding. And the fact that it is impossible is why it is appealing to us. And it's why it was appealing to Moses. I must go see this. He saw something that he'd never seen before that couldn't possibly exist. He's automatically drawn to that. And we're automatically drawn to that, I think. The idea of a God who makes sense, the idea of a God that thinks like we do, a God that is defined in human terms, a God that has our weaknesses and our strengths and our decline and failure and all. We're not interested in a God like that. I realize that many gods in pantheons of times past, Greek and Roman gods, etc., they all have their foibles, they all have their weaknesses, they have their failures and even their deaths from time to time. That's ridiculousness in my eyes, and I trust in your eyes as well. That's not what a God is. That's a human depiction. This is not a human. It never has been. Even when the voice of God came from what appeared to be human form, it was never human. God is completely and totally different. And the fact that he is beyond understanding is what we are drawn to. In fact, we don't want a God. I certainly don't want a God anyway that makes sense. I don't want a God that is easily defined, easily depicted, easily described somehow. The reason that we are frustrated at the concept of God is precisely why we are drawn to God, or why some people at least are drawn to God. He is beyond our understanding. He makes no sense at all. And yet, when we come to him, all of our questions are answered in a way that other beings, other so-called gods never possibly could. It's an astonishing kind of relationship that we have with him. And maybe that's the point of the burning bush. Maybe that is the reason why he appears in this way. I've heard various attempts to try to explain the symbolism behind the fire in the bush and God is with his people. And maybe some of that's true, I don't know. But the Bible makes no effort at all to explain what this is. Only it's God appearing to Moses, and he happened to do it in a burning bush. And the simplicity of that and yet the profundity of that really strikes me. Maybe that's the whole point here. Maybe that's why the burning bush is not explained. God simply presents himself to us, and in relatively spectacular fashion. The miracles in the Bible are just astonishing. This is hardly the only example. You know the stories. And we're either drawn to this or we're repelled by this. And that Moses finds himself drawn, and we should find ourselves drawn as well. And if you're listening to this sermon, I trust that you are drawn. The idea of an all-powerful, a God that makes no sense at all, a God that is beyond human understanding, that does not fit in human parameters. That's the God that we want. We want a God who is stronger than we are because we want to trust in him. We've trusted in humans before. That didn't work out. We've trusted in ourselves before. Moses trusted in himself before. That didn't work out either. What we want is a God who is beyond human capabilities, beyond human understanding. And I think that we see this in the burning bush, something that exists, that clearly exists, that should not exist. And by its very nature, encourages us and urges us to go beyond what we have understood in the past and reach for something that is greater than ourselves. He is undeniable, and yet he is inexplicable. How can you possibly deny the existence of a God like this? That's what faith can do for us. Point number 2. God is wholly available to us, and yet he is completely unapproachable. God draws us to himself, and then when we come and he says, stop, no further. That's an amazing kind of thing. God has been with his people. He clearly says this for the last 400 years. And yet, as far as we can tell, he's made no communication. He's made no effort to reach out. There have been no prophets in the land. And this is actually something of a pattern. We see this at the end of the Old Testament as well, when God is changing administrations, when he's bringing in a new order, he's introducing a new way of doing things. For 400 years, and I think the timeline is not accidental, for 400 or so years, there is no communication from God at all between the Testaments. Before the coming of John the Baptist, before Anna and Simeon and angelic appearances everywhere and demon possession and all this outpouring of the Spirit, and of course Jesus' life and Jesus' death and resurrection itself, and the miracles that followed after that. The coming of Jesus into the world and related events were this explosion of activity that announced the coming of this new era and this new way of doing things in ways that could not possibly be missed by those who were paying attention. And the same thing is happening here. After centuries of silence, now here comes God, and he announces himself, here in small fashion, if you will, at the burning bush. But beyond this, there are going to be the 10 plagues, and there's going to be the Exodus itself, and there's going to be the tremendous spectacle at Mount Sinai, and other events that are oftentimes going to come through Moses and Aaron's hands. And on we could go, going into the invasion of Canaan ultimately. All of this is this explosion of activity, God announcing himself to his people. He wants to be part of their lives. He wants to be involved. And yet, there is a certain distance that is absolutely mandatory. You cannot completely approach this God. God is there for his people, but he is going to be the one who determines how and when we make contact and what that contact looks like. Even Moses himself. He comes to the burning bush and God says, stop. You have to remove remove your shoes rather from your feet. This is holy ground. You cannot approach God as you are. You must transform yourself. You must humble yourself. You must come on his terms and not your own. And this is a lesson that is sorely missed, I think, by a lot of people who take God for granted, who assume that God is negotiating with us, and whatever we are willing to give, that he loves us and he's willing to accept us as we are. That's not what that great hymn means, just as I am. It doesn't mean, and I don't know that it ever really meant, that God will accept you warts and all, without any expectation of change, without any condemnation of sin. No, we have to bow before this God. We have to take our sandals off if we're going to come to him. This is how God is with us all the time. Isaiah chapter 66, the first couple of verses, when we're attempting to remedy the temple, we're attempting to worship properly in the temple and bemoaning the fact that previous generations have not done so, God just almost dismisses entirely the idea of a temple at all. Who are you to build a temple to me? I can't dwell in human temples. It's the spirit of the heart that matters, whether you're at the temple or in your bedroom or anywhere else, a church house in the 21st century in America, whatever it happens to be, the one who's humble and contrite and trembles at my word. God tells Isaiah, that's the one that I'm looking for. And that one will find God, but find God on his terms. It's this marvelous balance that we find in the text. God reaching out to us, but then requiring things of us. Reaching out to us with grace and yet asking us to submit to him and submit to his will, which leads us to the third point. God is irresistible and yet requires obedience. This is a phenomenon that has puzzled many, many Bible scholars over the last few centuries. How can it be that an all-powerful God who is determined to save people might not save people? How is it that a God who will not be resisted, a God who is more powerful than the devil, more powerful than any temptation, who promises to be there for us and to lift us up and gives us the grace that conquers every sin, how could anybody be lost under these circumstances? Who resists his will? These hypothetical people ask Paul in the Roman letter. Well, the fact is, a lot of people resist his will. God is going to deliver his people. And then he tells Moses, this is what you have to do. I don't have a full explanation for why God does that, but I do know this. He does it constantly, consistently. There are really very few exceptions to this. The walls of Jericho are a great example. He tells Joshua, behold, I've given you the city. Now go march around it 7 times on the 7th day, 1 time for the first 6 days. Well, why do I have to do that, God? You told me that it was given to me. Well, it is given to you. And at the end of this day, there is not going to be any question who conquered the city of Jericho. But you have to walk. You have to go. You have to do what I've told you to do. And again, this is going to be one of those things where we have to bow to a God who is wiser than we are, accepting his wisdom, accepting his power, accepting his way. Do we have a full understanding why all of these things are necessary? Couldn't God save us without baptism? Couldn't God save us without obedience, without confession, without holiness? I don't know. All I know is that God says he's not going to do that. Yes, grace is a free gift of God, and then we must go out and put ourselves in the path of this grace. If you want, you can look at the thorn bush as being creation. It's called the thorn bush by a lot of people who know what kind of bush this is likely to be. I don't know that it's called in our text, any of our translations, a thorn bush, but it is a native bush there that is flawed, that is weak, that is associated necessarily with pain and distance, and it's not the kind of thing you want to cuddle with. And yet God comes and lives inside of this bush. He inhabits this bush and takes it over and winds up defining the bush. And instead of seeing it for its flaws, instead of seeing it for its weaknesses, its problems, instead it is a vessel for God, who under normal circumstances, the text says in Hebrews 12, verse 29, is a consuming fire. But he doesn't consume. Why is that? Because of God's grace, because God is gracious and loving to his people. He will not consume them, and they are going to test his patience. In fact, a couple of times in the wilderness, he's going to say he's going to consume them, and yet he does not. Moses begs for them. God tells us, in the day that you sin, you shall surely die. That's what he told Adam and Eve in the garden. And in a sense, they did, but in reality, in the normal sense of the word, they continued to live. And lived for hundreds and hundreds of years after that, if the text is taken at its face value. Such is the case with us. Why do we not die? Because we are submitting to this powerful, amazing God who defies explanation. If we were in charge, we would do things differently. And for a lot of people, that is testimony that proves that God can't possibly exist because he doesn't act like we act. Doesn't conform to our wisdom. In my mind, and I trust maybe in your mind as well, it's exactly the opposite. The reason that this God is marvelous, the reason that we submit to this God is precisely because he doesn't make sense, because he is outside of our scope. And so therefore, if he asks us to do something to receive his grace, we may scratch our head somewhat and wonder why in the world he would do that. And then we go out and do it. Why would we put up a fuss about this? Why would we try to resist him? And if we can, in that way, define ourselves as the faithful, as the children of God, and that's the way God consistently defines his people, Old and New Testament alike, those who will keep his commandments, or at least try. The man after God's own heart, like David was in 1 Samuel chapter 13, this one who is willing to submit to God. And maybe he's not going to do it perfectly. In fact, he's not going to do it perfectly. He may get it wrong 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, but he keeps coming back to God. He keeps taking his sandals off. He keeps bowing before this inexplicable God and asking for mercy. Such a one will, in fact, receive mercy. Not because we deserved it, not even really because we asked for it, but because our God is great and because our God will not consume. Our God is gracious and merciful and loving toward us, and he will deliver us out of Egypt. He will take care of us. He will restore to us what is ours. The world around us is frightful and absolutely in opposition to us, and it may seem from time to time that we're never going to get out of this. And God promises that we will. We just have to trust in him. We have to listen to the Savior that he sends, whether it's Moses in the Old Testament or Jesus now. We accept his Savior. We go where the Savior tells us to go. We do what the Savior tells us to do. And by this, we come into fellowship with this God who ordinarily would have destroyed us because of our weaknesses, destroyed us because of our failures. And yet he does not destroy us because we are his covenant people. He has made a promise to us, like he made a promise to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He has promised that he's going to save us, that he's going to deliver us, he's going to take us home to be with him in heaven after all this life is over. All we have to do is put ourselves in the path of that grace, allow ourselves to be the kind of people who are caught up in holy fire, refined by his process, made more holy, more righteous, rather than being destroyed through a lack of faith. There is never going to be a time when we fully understand the grace of God, where we fully understand what God is trying to do for us. But if we have faith like a mustard seed, Jesus says, we can have confidence that his will can be accomplished in our life, that we can be brought into fellowship with him, that we can reach this higher level of understanding, a higher level of service that can characterize us for the rest of our lives, as was the case with Moses. Not quite perfectly, but nevertheless characterized him. And we can leave a legacy of obedience and trust and faith that other people can follow after in times past. Such is the legacy that Moses leaves for us, that other great ones of the Bible times leave for us, that many of our elderly ones have left behind for us, that we have known and loved in times past. That can be the legacy that we leave for somebody else. If we will bow in the presence of the burning bush, if we will take off our sandals, humble ourselves before this God, accept him for who he is, including and particularly when he doesn't seem to make sense to us. These are challenges to our faith, but God can help us overcome them. And faith in this God is ultimately the only thing that is going to get us out of this life and into the next life. So have confidence in God, have confidence in his way that he has marked out for your life. And if the story of the burning bush can help along those lines, then by all means, read and study the burning bush more and more in these troubled times. Thank you very much for checking in. Thank you for being here. God bless.